Now, this evening, welcome to our participants. We are going to be focusing on the Horizon Europe settlement. I'm delighted that we've got George Freeman, MP, of course, as Science Minister, heavily involved in the negotiations that led us back into Horizon Europe. And after George, we'll be hearing as well from Professor Maria Leptin, who is President of the European Research Council. I know she did want to be here in person, but now has a breakfast meeting in Brussels first thing tomorrow morning. So she is joining us online. We'll then hear from Professor Christopher Smith, Executive Chair of the Arts and Humanities Research Council and UKRI's international champion. And our final speaker is Professor Mary Ryan from Imperial, where she's Vice Provost for Research and Enterprise. So there is a lot to discuss. We're first going to hear from George, and I should explain that the original plan was that we would look to the future. Now that the deal has been negotiated, we mustn't take it for granted. The challenge is to make the most of the deal in the circumstances that we now are in. So it was intended to be future-oriented. But of course, George, now that you've left government, if there were any retrospective observations, the more indiscreet, the better, about how we got into this situation, those would be a bonus, and we would not wish to deter you in any way. So now I hand over to George Freeman, former Science Minister, to describe you.
Well, thank you, David. Thank you all. Those keen observers of the comings and goings of science ministers will notice that I'm now in the next phase of tracking my former mentor, David. I'm now aiming to become a heavyweight elder statesman of science and technology and hounding ministers as they come and go to insist on forward-looking policy. Let me just firstly say, I'll be brief because there's some really important people here tonight and this is an important conversation. Firstly, just for those who, well, firstly to say, in the same way that if universities didn't exist, I think the finest minds in Whitehall would be saying, if only there were institutions, sovereign, free, deep-rooted institutions with heritage, history, culture that could train, teach, research, inspire, drive local economies, provide the pillars of an innovation economy. If only there were such a thing, how on earth could we create them? Unfortunately, we have universities. We have some great universities, and they're a really important part of our ecosystem. In the same way, I think people would say, if only there was a foundation for science and technology, a place that could bring people together without any sense of corporate captive, vested interest, just to bring the finest minds in the land who really care about science and technology together, to give a forum for ministers, but also for leaders in the sector and to drive the debate. And I just wanted to say that because the Foundation has been a great champion and a great forum and a great force in this mission that I've sort of made my mission for the last 13 years with David in the beginning and then trying to do my best to pursue it in the last few years. So let me just say three things, something about how we got here, because I can, David, to answer your challenge. Something about Horizon and Pioneer. And there's a question hanging over all this, which is, if we are going to be a global force, a global science and technology superpower, unpacked in the right way, then what's the right balance between Europe and the rest of the world? And then some reflections on what we've got to do now to really land this and take this deal and turn it into what it could be, and to make this a big moment, not just to get back to where we were, but to go much further. So in order, reflections on how we got here. I think the first meeting I had 2 years ago when I returned to government was in this building. I think it was hosted, David, by you or Greg Clark, Adrian, and many of you here tonight to talk about this very question. And it seemed to me that to go right back, when the trade continuity or the Brexit deal was being negotiated, it was an absolute red line for me, and also for Boris Johnson at the time and Michael Gove and a number of others, that whether you wanted to or not, we were leaving the political union, but we were absolutely not leaving the scientific, the cultural, the defense, the security unions. And in fact, if you're going to leave the political union, in my view and others, you need to redouble your commitment to the other institutions. And it was in that context that I came back into this role 2 years ago and was as appalled as you all were to see that actually, you know, just to remind everyone, we did actually negotiate back in that Brexit deal in 2020 to be in Horizon, Copernicus and Euratom. But I say that not to undermine the understandable, I think, irritation, anger in the European Union that a deal they thought they'd done in Northern Ireland was not honoured. And in that situation, they felt it was appropriate to weaponize Horizon to force everyone to focus on it. And it's not for me to comment on whether that was the right decision, but it was a clear decision. And so it seemed to me that we needed to do two things. One, resolve Northern Ireland, which wasn't in my purview. But two, while that was being done, repairing the relationship with our European partners, we needed to do everything we could to prepare to get back into Horizon, to keep the flame of Horizon membership alive, to wear out the shoe leather in reassuring everyone across Europe that we did not want to leave, that we want to be back in, and but also to prepare for the potential eventuality that we couldn't. And I was quite surprised to find there was no plan B when I arrived at all. There was a single piece of paper, which was basically the three pillars of Horizon with the Union Jack on the top, which is not a plan B at all. And to be fair, Boris at the time said, you know, well, if there's no plan B, then I mean, really, you know, how are we ever going to? And he was right, actually. So it seemed to me we needed a proper plan B, and I called it plan B, by the way, because I wanted to remind everyone that plan A was to get back into Horizon as quickly as we could. But it also seemed to me an opportunity to ask some quite big questions that needed to be asked. And Adrian and others here had flagged that if we really intend to be a global player in the science and technology global race and a leader in deploying, harnessing science research, technology and innovation, each different, to tackle the big global challenges and to attract billions into this country, then I think you do have to ask yourself, look over the 3 years of the total science budget, or the total R&D budget across government, 52 billion. The total, if you're front loading a Horizon membership, 6 billion in, equalize it, 5 billion, say, over 3 years. Beyond Europe, global, about 500 million. Are those ratios? Now, I accept that a lot of that UK spend investment is global in nature as well. I'm not suggesting it isn't. But I think you do have to ask the question, does that feel right? Is that the right balance? So in doing the Pioneer piece, I wanted to ask, look, if we had to take that Horizon money and redeploy it, what could we do with it globally? And I was doing that partly because I felt we needed to do it, partly because it seemed to me that we might discover some things that we wanted to do in addition to being an active member of Horizon. And I hope that there are some things in that Pioneer prospectus that future governments will look at and say, we should do that as well. Just to complete your challenge of how did we get here, as I said to the House of Lords Science and Technology Committee yesterday, by the way, Parliament at its best, a completely private conversation between some pretty eminent peers on the Science and Tech Committee and the former minister in private. George, your reflections on where we are, how we got here. And that is Parliament working at its best, totally non-partisan, deep conversation, lessons learned that will be recycled anonymously back to ask the next minister. So I just share that with you because it was something that doesn't get seen in our system. And they were asking the same question, how did we get here? And I'll make the point now that I made to them, that it seemed to me that in January 22, it was pretty obvious to me, looking at the Horizon program, 3 pillars, the talent pillar, ERC, the second pillar, the global and the industrial, and then the third, innovation. Pillar 1 is completely essential. Well, I forget the exact numbers. We had over 120, 30 top professors here, ERC professors. When 2 or 3 of them started saying to me, George, the EU are ringing me up saying, if we're not in, I've got to go back. That's a disaster. And it seemed to me that we absolutely had to set out a really big, bold reassurance that if they didn't want to go, we would match that with a big fellowship program. But more than that, that we actually need to take the opportunity to address, I think, some quite structural weaknesses in our early, mid, and late stage ecosystem. I think we're taking our research community for granted. And the old model, the junior doctor model of you on the rat wheel of grant applications, that eventually you might become a professor and then you'll be on the rat wheel of grant applications. And it's not attractive for people. It's not productive. And when I met, some of you will have heard me say this, that brilliant young biomedical scientist, she was 29 from Oxford. I met her at the Max Planck Institute, and she'd just been awarded their big fellowship, 10-year funding for her, and a postdoc, and a technician, and a discretionary budget, and the choice of all the Max Planck Institutes. Pretty attractive. And I said, tell me, had you always wanted to move to Germany? She said, I never wanted to move to Germany, but who can resist this? And quite soon she'll have a German partner and a German family, and she's our loss, and I can't blame her. So it seems to me that we, in that Horizon Pioneer Pillar 1, I was also trying to say, look, we really do need to think about whether we shouldn't have a much stronger fellowship offer. And I hope some of that will indeed some of it has already come through in the autumn statement. Of course, the Treasury, if you're going to do long-term fellowships, you need to endow them. Treasury like 3-year funding. I don't think anyone else does. I think if you're going to do science and technology seriously as a nation, 3-year funding doesn't cut it. And fellowships certainly need to be longer. And I think the withdrawal of the welcome, or partial withdrawal of the welcome from the fellowship space, has left a bit of a gap. So I think that's a really important part of the pillar. Pillar 2 I looked at, and of course we have a different structure of economy from France and Germany, but it's basically Rolls-Royce and then hundreds of companies I'd never heard of. And the Rolls-Royce participation wasn't huge. It's a fraction of their R&D. Whereas in France and Germany, you're looking at 30, 40, 50 big regional, national, global players, big engineering businesses for whom Horizon is a major part of their existence. We don't sadly have that kind of economy anymore, but I just make that observation that there weren't that many big corporates involved. So I turned to Pillar 3. I thought, well, we'll hoover up there, obviously, as an innovation economy. And there, it was very striking. There were lots of tiny little SMEs, but not that many commercial companies growing at scale. And the reason, really, when you ask them is, well, it's basically an academic process. You have to fill in lots of forms to do the academic thing. It's not really designed for small companies. But it was quite striking. We weren't getting very good return rates there either. So hence Pioneer, 3 pillars, a big talent piece, a big industry innovation piece. And it seemed to me that we could then put some money into different sectors, use it to leverage in co-investment. If you industry in agri-tech, in clean tech, in space, in fusion, in robotics, if you'll put some money into a program, we'll 50-50 it, we'll make it much more attractive. And on the innovation pillar, similarly, make it something that really catalyzes, more like a catalyst fund that would really drive much stronger SME and investor engagement. How many VCs, investors in S&T, had Horizon companies in their portfolio? Very few. And they weren't even thinking about it. Unlike when I was a VC, we always had a smart award. We always, because they were easy, simple, clear, reliable, well-structured. Whereas Horizon's designed for poor academics who are used to filling in endless forms. So that was my thinking behind Pioneer. And I think there's some stuff in there that is very relevant to the landscape reviews, to the nurse to Kell grant reviews, to making our research ecosystem much more globally competitive, the Formula 1 engine that you would have heard me talk about. If China's at 260 billion, America's at 300 billion a year, and we're going to 20, great, but it had better be into a Formula 1 engine of efficiency and impact, and it isn't yet. So I was thinking that the Pioneer program would help us to do that, but also help us to deepen those international collaborations, both in Europe and beyond. And while we were negotiating, it seemed to me that I should go immediately to the powerhouse R&D economies, the small nations that pack a punch in R&D, Switzerland, Israel, Japan, countries who are not in the Washington, Beijing, or Brussels group, but want to have deep alliances and have got really strong R&D. They welcomed us with open arms, and I've negotiated big strategic framework agreements, Pillar 1 discovery, Pillar 2 industry incentive, innovation, Pillar 3 government diplomacy, regulation, skills, and all of that stuff. So, and I was doing that partly thinking, well, if we're not in Horizon, then those would provide structures and frameworks that we could repeat. And I'm delighted we then did that same structure for Canada, and I was just in the process of getting it going for France, Germany, Italy. And by the way, in each of those, pillar 1 and 3, we're going to have secondments and exchanges, because it seems to me if you're going to be back in Horizon without free movement, boy, we need to make it much easier for talented researchers across Europe to come into our system. So that was the thinking. That's my sort of second piece, the thinking around Pioneer. And I would just make this observation in Liberation, David, that it seemed to me blindingly obvious by about the end of February that that's what we should do. And the Treasury, in my view, took the view, not so fast. We'd rather take a bit of time and we'll claw back some money. And I think we could have been much speedier to deploy that money into the fellowships, into some of those industry collaborations, into some of those catalyst funds. And it seems to me that it rather suited the Treasury to move rather more slowly. And is this public? Well, perhaps you could be discreet. Okay. So to be fair to the Treasury, they face a huge and horrendous problem in managing the public finances. And the instinct can be to constrain public spending by taking time to approve the funding. And David, when I returned to government, said, you'll be amazed, things that we used to approve in 9 months are now taking 2.5 years. It's a serious problem. Now, whether that's by accident or design, if you want to move at pace in S&T and be globally competitive, it isn't working. And so I think we missed a trick. We could have launched Pioneer in that Q1 of 22. And I would have said to the EU, look, we're desperate to come back, really keen, but while we're out, we're not just going to be benched. We'll deploy this money, and anything we deploy, obviously, will have to come off the bill, the re-entry bill. And the quicker you get on the phone and the quicker we can agree, the better for everyone. I think it would have helped the negotiation a bit as well. But anyway, didn't happen. And then when the deal was done, I think the last thing I'd say is, having been Minister for Fusion, it was very interesting to me that actually Ian Chapman and the team at UKRI said, look, to be honest, the Euratom program, we've been lucky enough to host it for 40 years. In the next phase, ITER is a huge project. If we're going to go for a moonshot, try and be the first country to deploy fusion industrially, Ian's advice to me and the team was, they're going to ring us up every week anyway to ask what to do. If you can get the money out of Euratom, put 650 million into a moonshot race for industrial fusion, we might really be able to pull this off. It's a punt, but I think it's a smart move. So for any of you who are wondering why out of Euratom, it was completely deliberate. And I didn't think at first we'd be able to negotiate. The EU don't like, cherry picking. So actually, to be fair to the Treasury, I think we ended up, although we lost a year, I think we ended up in a place that, not least because of the way they structured the deal, the EU very, very keen to signal that they want us back. It's not just a sort of an agreement in name, but not in effect. They actually want us back. And I think that's partly because of our allies and friends across Europe. And I thank all of you who mobilized those friends. And Ursula von der Leyen and the Prime Minister have a very strong working relationship. And the deal is they'll basically guarantee that we get back what we used to get back. And we can now get back up to 108% of our contributions. And that's huge. So that brings us to the last bit. What do we do now? Firstly, I think it liberates the UKRI and Ottoline, who've been doing amazing work preparing to launch this whole vast Pioneer program. We can park it. I think we can get back to the core business of making our system more competitive. And on Horizon, to wrap up, huge opportunity, not just to get back to what we were doing, but ergo, following from the points I've made, I think to get sectors, all of these high growth sectors, clean tech, agri-tech, space, fusion, quantum, engineering, biology, to be actively thinking, do we have a Horizon program? Are we encouraging all of our researchers and companies to be in it? And secondly, our investor community. If you're not actively supporting and asking your researchers, why not? And the answer was, well, it's quite complicated, it's rather academic, so we've agreed to set up a unit supported by some big corporates and some of the leading university folk who know how to fill in the forms as a support house to help companies access this money. So I will close this by saying I think we've got an opportunity. to not just get back into Horizon, key though that is, but to make this a moment where in 5 years people look back and say, well, we didn't get back in. Actually, we got all the high growth sectors committed. They all promoted it. And next year the phone rang and Europe said, we got a problem. You're heading for 120% of your contributions. That's where we want to get to. And I think we could get quite quickly there as long as HMG and the sector really pick it up and run with it. I'll stop there, David. Thank you very much for this conversation, and I'm really looking forward to your thoughts.
Yeah. Thank you very much indeed, George, and some very interesting reflections there on how we got to where we are now. And we are, of course, now members, and I'm delighted that we have the president of the ERC, Professor Maria Leptin, joining us online. She, of course, in her distinguished career, has worked at the Laboratory of Molecular Biology in Cambridge. She was then director of the European Molecular Biology Organization in Heidelberg. She is a foreign fellow of the Royal Society, where we are today, an international member of the US National Academy of Sciences. And I very much hope, Professor Leptin, that we have got you on the line now. I'm handing over to you in the hope that in a moment we hear from you.
Well, I'm speaking, so I see a thumbs up. You hear me, yes?
Fantastic. Over to you. Thank you so much.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Yes, it's really a shame I'm not there with you this evening. Lord Willetts, I thank you for the invitation. It would have been wonderful to be there. I love England. I love the UK. So sorry I'm not there. But the good thing is, of course, that we've got you back. Now, the Scientific Council of the ERC has always believed that this association of the UK to Horizon Europe was really important from all sorts of perspectives. Our UK colleagues have been an important part of the ERC's calls from the very start. And so having you participate in ERC is a clear benefit for the entire European Framework Program in terms of competition, prestige, being able to fund cutting edge research. And it's really very simple. Why do we care? And also, why should the UK care? It's about competition at the very highest level, and it's in both directions. If you're a researcher from an EU member state and you win an ERC grant in competition with researchers from the UK, and hopefully soon again from Switzerland, it means that you're playing at a very high level playing field, and that includes all the best researchers in Europe. So for EU researchers competing with UK, that pushes everyone here to raise our game and to come up with the very best ideas. But the same is, of course, true for the UK researchers competing with the rest of us. The level is simply not the same if you're competing only at a national level. And this is, of course, not an accidental effect. The framework program funding is only a thin sliver of overall EU's funding on research and development. But one of the main aims of those who first conceived the ERC was exactly to raise the level of science, to raise the level of competition, to challenge the very best to come up and hone their best ideas. So that's the benefit for both sides. That's why it's important for both sides. But there's also, of course, for the UK, very much more direct benefit. And that is the collaborative parts of the framework program, where they're very direct and simple. Being able to choose partners from the UK means for our colleagues here that we can have better and larger networks. We have a higher chance of finding groups of colleagues, of achieving the aims of any project we come up. And again, it's the same for our colleagues in the UK, who can come up with ideas of joint projects all across Europe. So the Association of UK is clearly a win-win on both sides scientifically. And this is a feeling that's shared really across the entire European scientific community. We on our side never wavered in our support for UK association. You've seen campaigns like Stick to Science. We've done a lot of direct lobbying. And like I say, we're hoping that Switzerland will soon be back in as well. So once again, welcome back. You've been missed. And I sincerely hope you get your 120%. There is one little piece of bitter news that I learned of today or yesterday that will affect us, and that will affect science in Europe, and particular in the UK. And that is that I understand that the government, in order to have a better control over migration, has raised the minimal salaries that are necessary for people to be allowed to work in the UK. Now, this will affect postdocs, and that I hope there will be a rethink of that. So that's for the future. And turning to the future in more general terms, we here in Brussels are already planning, working to prepare the next EU framework program, Framework Program 10, FP10. We think that the ERC has given the entire EU framework program a new dimension that it didn't used to have before 2007, alongside their traditional top-down elements. And the EU should build on the success that we've seen, and we're hoping that we can get everyone to agree that it's important to strengthen the ERC in the next framework program. We've seen amazing creativity come from ERC within ERC-funded projects, talent of Europe's best researchers being deployed when they're given the freedom to define their own paths, follow their own ideas, follow their own thoughts with no strings attached. I agree about the red tape. There is red tape, but the good thing is in the ERC, there is practically none, and really the freedom, the guarantee of freedom to follow one's own ideas is what has driven this success. You know, you can look anywhere. So we were talking about technology innovation, and it's really ERC researchers that have made the breakthroughs in critical technologies like artificial intelligence, which was not invented 2022 when ChatGPT was released, but has been worked on by ERC funded and other scientists for a long time. Quantum technologies is another example. So we believe that it's actually necessary to significantly increase the spending for research and innovation at the EU level in the next spending period from 2028 to 34, in which we, of course, hope that we will continue to have the UK as members. Despite the excellent quality of projects funded by the ERC, it is a sad fact that many equally outstanding proposals have to remain unfunded because we simply don't have the budget to fund everything that is judged as excellent and worth funding by our panels. We've also not changed grant sizes since 2009. They remain at the same funding level per grant, which is not surprising because if we were to increase the amounts, we'd have to reduce the numbers. But that has, of course, been eroding the value and the prestige of ERC's grants. So we really need to do something about that as well. I think in the interest of time, we're running a little bit behind time. I'll stop going on about that. It will be necessary to have more funding. It'll also be important to protect the ERC's independence, to run our own calls, to manage our own grants, and to have our own mechanisms to do all these things. And so we will call upon the European Commission and its partners and for support from the European scientific community, including that of the UK, to strengthen the UK's the ERC's independence and autonomy under Framework Program 10, and to support additional funding to safeguard the ERC's position as Europe's top frontier research funder and as a valuable partner throughout Europe. So That's where I'll leave it at the moment, and I thank you for listening.
Very interesting observations, and particularly getting us to think about the next framework program and the place of the ERC in it is a very important message. And there's a lot of people here and nodding their heads and paid attention to that. Before we move on to our next speaker, can I just say that when you said that you had no bureaucracy in the ERC, that there are some who might think that was towards the optimistic end of the interpretation. Yes. Would you just like to say, do you think there's anything that could be done?
Yes, I'm sorry. It is not true that there's no bureaucracy at the ERC. No, it is not true. If I'm right there, I will lead the pack who says there is bureaucracy and even too much bureaucracy. I will, and you know, if I had my way, there would be a lot less. That was part of my last pitch, that we really, the ERC is unusual in the EC and EU framework. We are guaranteed independence by the legislation. We will have to work on being allowed to implement that independence at every level, and I will count on you all to make that clear for the next framework program.
Right, that's very helpful. There does seem to be an unavoidable process of accruing complexity in these grant processes. It's a battle we in the UK, and indeed we would hope to robustly support you in the ERC. Well, Professor Leptin, you've kindly agreed, I think, to stay and listen, and we were going to have 2 more interventions here, and then there'll be Q&A. And Professor Leptin, if you are able to stay for that, I'm sure there will be questions that people will wish to put to you after we've heard from our third speaker, Professor Chris Smith, who I'm sure you know, Executive Chair of the Arts and Humanities Research Council, and as UKRI International Champion, very heavily involved in this issue within UKRI. Chris, over to you.
Thank you. Looking around this, there's a slight element of this which feels a bit like a survivor's dinner. Because I was there 2 years ago as well. I think we should have a medal from that particular dinner coined for those who saw it through. And indeed, I was senior responsible owner in UKRI for our part of Pioneer, working very closely, of course, with the Minister and our colleagues in DSIT Civil Service to produce that alternative. It's a matter of wry reflection that all of that work came to a halt in a 5-minute conversation from DSIT 2 days before we announced our association. But as George has said, I think there's a great deal in there that we can carry forward. Now, what I would like to do, I've got a lot of slides, but I'm going to pick out a few key points from each of them to try to make an argument. And the argument is this: that A, we are an exceptionally powerful international science player already. B, that is exceptionally important for us as a country. And C, that Horizon Europe must be seen within that broad international context, which follows, I think, very much a point that was made earlier about the balance that we need to think about, whether in or out of Horizon Europe. So you know what UKRI is, the largest public funder of research and innovation in the UK, working with DSIT now to cover all sectors and disciplines, including, of course, innovation. Our strategy and our vision of transforming tomorrow together, critically, I think, has taken the previous research councils and their independent missions into a single body, which has a capacity to operate in ways not entirely dissimilar from the unified vision that Horizon Europe represents, and includes within that the possibility to think in terms of missions in ways that Horizon Europe has done, and which research councils independently and individually perhaps could not. And that is coming through the UKRI strategy. And I point in particular to the strategic themes, which not accidentally look not entirely dissimilar from some of the mission areas that you see in Horizon, and are allowing us to start to concentrate on ways in which we can genuinely fund interdisciplinarity and the breaking down of silos between disciplines that we all look for. Why is our international collaboration so important? I think the really important point that I want to take from this is that collaborating internationally makes science better. It's not simply a kind of thing that we do just for the sake of it. The field-weighted citation index there shows that when we collaborate, then our research is more widely read, more widely used, and has a greater impact. And I think that key UK strategies, from the Global Britain in a Competitive Age, the Integrated Review, the Government Strategy for International Development, are all showing that we do this not, as it were, out of pure altruistic intent, but because it actually makes our science and our community, our ecosystem, better. How does UKRI support international collaboration? Critically, internationalism is part of the UKRI brand, and it's part of the UKRI mission. So we have both investigator-led international collaboration and dedicated international funding to address gaps and opportunities. And key here in the orange circle is the International Science Partnerships Fund, which in a sense was something which came from the discussions that were around and about whether we could or could not reassociate, and was constructed in a way to make sure that some of our global ambitions were sustained alongside the possibility of association. And the size of that pot, the ISPF pot, would of course have been larger in the context of non-association, but it is still a very important counterweight to the relative proportions which George cited earlier between Europe and the rest of the world. And if you look at the map of where UKRI is supporting funding of our ecosystem, you can see that across the years, we have covered the map pretty effectively in terms of UKRI overseas offices, including the one in Brussels, UKRI, which will be supporting participation very strongly, research facilities, the Antarctica, the Arctic Circle, Gambia, Uganda, for instance, major infrastructure investments across the world, research ships which can travel across the seas. So there's a huge amount that's actually already going on, which is, I would argue, the necessary precursor to further international collaboration. If you do not have this system, this ecosystem, we will not be able to forge the ongoing collaborations that will allow the excellent science which Maria Leptin, who has been such a close ally of us through all of this, asked to see. In numbers, since 2018, we've collaborated with 181 countries. We have a portfolio of 2.3 billion with the USA now. 33% of our funding is international, over 6,000 collaborating organizations overseas, and already 900 million in 23-24 in our international partnerships. So this is the reality of an international funder and an international ecosystem, which means that as we flow through the process that we've been through, we have retained and can build on an international capacity. And we have an international strategic framework in UKRI, which permits us to set out our directions of travel in alignment with government and thinking about the future to effect change across all of the parts of the UKRI international strategic framework. And I won't go through these, they'll be familiar to you. People and careers, places, ideas, innovation, impacts, and being a world-class organization, where I would say that there are figures which show that the overhead administration of UKRI grants is actually lower than the overhead administration of ERC grants, which I'm very proud about, but it's not a competition. We both do things in our own way. Now, association to Horizon Europe, the history of this has already been well described here, and we don't need to go through it again. But the key thing, I guess, is that we have something called the guarantee, which is helping us through the transition. And that guarantee was a critical arrangement that was agreed and is delivered by UKRI. And I'll come to the figures on that for a moment. We're not yet, as it were, in the sense that we start from work package 24. And it is important to bear in mind that there will be this moment of transition between work package 23 and work package 24. So we will be seeing the results of our participation some way down the line, and that's important to bear in mind. However, all calls in work program 24 are covered by association, and you can see exactly the pillars which George just a few moments ago outlined. Now, what will we do to maximize the UK's engagement in Horizon Europe? Here we see again the value of UKRI, I think, operating as a collective body. We have a Brussels office in UKRO, which has, through the period of association, through the period of uncertainty, and now again supported organisations to understand what the calls are. And that goes not just for universities, but also critically for business. And on the innovation side, I'd like to point to the incredibly important role of the UK National Contact Points and Innovate UK in making sure that the more difficult incentivisation of businesses, their levers aren't quite the same as they are for universities, can be pulled. The guarantee allows us critically to make sure that there has been a trajectory through. These are grants that were assessed by Horizon Europe, but funded by UKRI. And you can see the figures here, which are really important. As of 31st of October 23, we've awarded over 2,700 grants worth over £1.4 billion to UK-based researchers and innovators. What that's telling us is that we didn't stop being part of Europe, and we didn't stop being excellent. And that's really important because that's the basis on which we move forward. It's also, I think, important that we bear in mind that because this tails on, and we won't know about work package 24 for a while, when government legitimately asks for evidence of the effect of participation and the success of it, we mustn't get caught on a numbers game of just counting the number of applications. The critical thing, as Maria Leptin pointed out, and as George has pointed out, is the excellence of the research that comes. And we mustn't get put into a game which says that you've got to have hundreds more grants. There's no value in bad applications. There's only value in winning applications. And I think that's important we bear in mind. And I think, and I'll be quick now because I know you want to move us on, but I want to say that the reason why I think we can be confident that UK research and innovation will bounce back to that 120%, which George has been asking for, is because around Horizon Europe, through the period of transition, we have maintained our mechanisms for international collaboration generally. So international co-investigators and visiting research policies, reciprocal agreements, for instance, with Norway and Switzerland, lead agency agreements, joint thematic calls, partnership building mechanisms, fellowships, which we have had and which are bolstered in the autumn statement, but which have been running, and also multilateral policy engagement. And I think it's really important that we bear in mind, in thinking about the balance, that association with Horizon Europe is not just association with Europe, it is also association with other countries outside of Europe which are participants in the Horizon Europe framework and allow for third-party country arrangements, and that our multilateral policy engagement with Global Research Council, OECD Global Science Forum, Science Europe, which last week I was very proud to be elected a member of the governing board, allow us to create a multilateral engagement from which science can grow. And those are some of the other funding frameworks. I think for the purposes of time, I'll stop there, but simply just to reiterate the key point. The success of the UK in Horizon Europe in previous iterations depended on the strength of the UK's domestic capacity and the strength of its broad international collaboration. Through the period of uncertainty, we collectively maintained those international collaborations and our domestic strength. And for us to be successful in the future, we must do that again. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Christopher. And of course, it is worth remembering that the guarantee that I was on the board at the time, that we were able to operate at UKRI also depended on the ERC being willing to continue to consider UK applications, even when we were not officially being allowed into Horizon. And I think we all appreciate what the ERC did and Professor Leptin did to make that possible, rolling the programme forward. We're now going to hear from Professor Mary Ryan, Vice Provost for Research and Enterprise at Imperial, Professor of Material Science there. And I think it'll be really interesting to hear how Imperial, such a key player in Horizon, is finding the new arrangements. But Mary, over to you.
Well, thank you very much. It's always dangerous to go last in any of these scenarios because most of the interesting things have been said, and Chris always has all the amazing data. So I tried to give this from I guess a personal and a university perspective. I'm going to reiterate some of the arguments that's been made by the sector over the last few years because I think it's important to, I guess, remember why we thought this was important, but also to hold on to those arguments because we are going to go through the next framework and how do we kind of make sure that we maintain that position and maintain, I guess, a focus on the importance of our partnerships in Europe. Obviously, confirmation of association is remarkable news for the future of the UK and EU research and innovation. There's often a shorthand when we talk about European work and we say European science, British science, and that's a huge chunk of it. But I think it's really important, and coming from Imperial, I think it's also critical for me to say this. This is beyond just science and technology. The humanities, the arts, the creative industries are really well supported by the European programs. And actually those sectors were very, very concerned that they would be squeezed out of some of those conversations. So making sure we took that holistic view of what research is and how all those different pillars fit together is really critical. And this collaborative research and innovation that's been made possible by Horizon, I'm going to argue why I think that is really critical to our networks, is really important for the future health of the UK's science and research base, but also our national security and prosperity. Imperial College, we're a global university. Most UK universities are global universities. I think that's a really important factor. We're not in a national silo. We all act globally. And from day one, we've campaigned relentlessly on Horizon. Even when it felt quite desperate, like we thought it might not happen, we were steadfast. And I think that's really recognition that the European partners are so critical to what we do. In my role, I also sat on the working group for Plan B, and it was interesting, the unity of the sector in those meetings and generally in our messaging was, I wouldn't say totally unwavering, but the most steadfast of anything that I have witnessed. And you know, we'd have those meetings went in the diary at the last minute, and everybody dropped everything to make those meetings. They were really critical, and I think that was a measure of how important it was. Nobody wanted to stop calling it Plan B when there was a suggestion we have another name. Like, no, we're keeping Plan B, because that was, I think, like you said, George, an important message that there was a Plan A that we were holding on to. But I would agree, some of those thinking that went into Pioneer, it was a really interesting and useful stress test, right, on how critical was this partnership to us, and what was it that you might do with similar funding that would be different. And some of those ideas I think will carry through. And it was a really important exercise, actually, and we should do it more often. You're just testing, are we doing it right? Is this the right way? What are the alternatives? And convincing ourselves that it's correct. The European program, it's the world's largest multilateral research program. I think it's important to remember that, because we are in a global research economy. This is the biggest program. The Americans, the Chinese, the rest of South America, there are big programs. The European program is the biggest, and that's really important. And that gives us access to networks, flows of ideas, talent, and funding at a scale that is really important globally. And it gives us what I like to think of as a multiplier effect on our own research. So as an example, in Horizon 2020 projects at Imperial, we were part of projects that totaled over $2 billion, euros, dollars, almost the same, over the course of that program. So there's the direct funding that came to Imperial was multiplied 27 times by those partnerships. We were in partnerships with 16 different countries across that space. That gives you access to data, infrastructure, and knowledge, and talent from all those different regions. And why is that important? Right? I mentioned China and the US, and George mentioned the numbers that are being invested there. It's a huge competitive space, and this multiplier effect, I would argue, is actually critical to UK success and UK excellence, because we are driving thought leadership. We have got excellent, we regularly talk about how many universities are in the global top 10, top 50. I'd argue that being part of the European programs is key to that and key to maintaining our excellence on the global stage. The association at Horizon, I think, is also the bedrock of the UK policy, actually, in being, I'm going to use the word science superpower, because I think we genuinely can be. It's genuinely a space where we can drive prosperity. And there's been, I think, dedicated support that this government has shown through its many incarnations, the kind of commitment to the knowledge-based economy through investment in R&D, dedicated government departments to focus on delivery. I was going to say improvements to the visa systems. I think we're all slightly concerned about that. I mean, I think it's true to say the science visas will sit hopefully outside of that remit. So Maria, might not be as bad as you think. But it is important that we think about the science and the research ecosystem and how we think about technical staff and the broader space. So making sure we do protect that and the global talent visas and access for students. While we waited for association, we didn't just sit back. We've still been competing. We have been successful in over 170 proposals, nearly 100 million euros in funding that's come into Imperial. And one thing I think that's critical to realize is that we saw massive enthusiasm amongst our community to keep applying sometimes when it felt a bit frustrating and that there was uncertainty. Particularly with the ERC and that talent space, people wanting access to that globally recognized position. And it's not just about how much money does it bring, it's about the prestige. Again, it's about being part of that community. But what we also saw is that we didn't see a change in success rates. So there was a perception that, oh, well, if I apply, I'll be judged differently to people from other countries and other institutions. We didn't see any evidence of that. And that was kind of a reassurance, again, that we were seen as part of the European community. Again, reflected by not just the steadfast commitment from the sector in the UK, but from our European partners. We also kind of doubled down on our European bilateral engagements, and that is seen as kind of not just an insurance policy, but actually, I guess, a restatement of commitment that we wanted to make sure we had those strong relationships. So we launched an international research center with CNRS. It's the only other one in Europe. And they're, CNRS is right on our doorstep, but it's that, covers essentially the whole of French science, and really gives us now, I guess, a really great platform to move back into kind of gearing up our Horizon engagement. I want to comment just briefly on the agreement, because I think it's easy to forget that we actually have a really good outcome here, because it was so frustrating and it felt like it took a long time. Actually, we're in a good place. The Euratom, I agree. I've talked to Ian about this. It's where we need to be, I think, for fusion, and the ambition for fusion that the funding's being put in there is important. We're able to lead programs. We have access to the ERC, and Maria's been fighting steadfast that it's really important that we have got to a good place, and it's a good deal going forwards. It's a good deal going forwards with a limited time frame. I think we do need to look forwards to what's the next iteration. How do we, first of all, make sure we do ramp up our engagement, we get to 120%. But also we think about, where does UK thought leadership sit in developing the next frameworks, and how do we get in those conversations without commitment to be continually engaged? And so I think that, we have a general election potentially coming up. We have changes of different flavors of government, or in the same government flavor, different ministers and different policies. That kind of stability, and it can be ambitious but stable at the same time. How do we kind of make sure that we keep that so we are able to shape the next programs and really drive, I think, that UK science into European programs? Maria talked about maintaining independence in the ERC, and for a lot of the drivers from the UK perspective was this recognition that the European programs, because they are multilateral programs, are inherently independent from minutiae of national politics. And actually, learning that ERC feels like it's going to lose some of that independence, I think, is a big concern for us. And as a community, we need to make sure that we do lobby to maintain that independence, because it's critical, I think, for maintaining excellence and integrity in the scheme. Going forwards, I think I'm really confident that we have the talent and the will to move forwards. There are some areas that I think are really critical. So we have to have a well-funded and a well-founded research base to step into and lead those programs. And UKRI is obviously at the heart of that, but also the academies and the fellowship programs that we know are critical to attracting people. We have to be open to attracting the talent, as well as obviously growing our own. And I think thinking about graduate programs as part of this scheme is really important. One thing, I think one area at Imperial that, and probably beyond, is there's a layer of academics and researchers that are coming through. So early career researchers that have been kind of growing in this hiatus. So they may not have established the European networks that there's more senior colleagues have, and they're, how do we accelerate those people into kind of that broader network, and creating seed funds and engagement programs and leadership fellowship programs for that community, so that we make sure we do have a continuing solid base and we don't end up with this gap of connected people. I want to just touch a little again, I guess, linking to the Pioneer and how we connect Europe to the broader international programs. Imperial, over the last 10 years, our academics have co-authored papers with people in 192 countries. That's nearly all countries. It's an international thing. But interestingly, if you look at our papers that we write with the US, 60% of those also have a European co-author. So we are not doing European collaborations here, and American, and that's not how science works. And so recognizing and thinking how we connect the European programs to the broader international partnerships is going to be, I think, a key challenge and probably more of a key opportunity for us in that space. So I will stop talking. I think we've got new research, new challenges, new opportunities, independence, well-funded research base, and onwards and upwards. Thank you.
Thank you. Great. Yes, Mary, you're there. Brilliant. Well, thank you for some really interesting and encouraging points from all of our participants. And, Mary's observation about the people kind of equivalent of the COVID school generation, the researchers who've missed out on the experience of engaging the EU for the last few years, very important. Now, I think Professor Leptin is with us. She's not going to stay with us for much longer.
Yep, I'm here.
Brilliant, fantastic. Because we're going to break for dinner in a little while, but I'm going to prioritize people who have specific questions for her first, while she has kindly remained a participant. And so I'm looking first of all around the hall. If there's any person here who would like to ask a question to her. Yes, I see down. And if you could give your name and organization, because we can't see Palab.
It's Palab Ghosh from BBC News. This is a question for Professor Leptin, but for all of you. But it's something that Mary alluded to. How much ground was lost by the delay? George did a fantastic job, and his colleagues, not single-handedly, the government did a great job in keeping the show on the road. But what has been the ground that's lost, and what needs to be done if we have lost any significant ground to regain that ground?
Yeah, I think let's start with Professor Leptin, especially the latter half. If ground has been lost, how do we regain it now?
I'm actually not sure ground has been lost. It's of course been incredibly frustrating for UK researchers to be told you're selected for an ERC grant and then you can't get an ERC grant, because as I said, part of the grant is the recognition that you've won in that international competition, not just a national competition. We did find ways to allow them to have some of that recognition by saying selected by ERC, funded by UKRI. And of course, it was great that the UKRI agreed on that phrasing. I think what I'm hoping is that all UK researchers trust the new situation and come and apply. That's all we need. But they have been applying. We've seen a small dip. We've also seen a dip in the participation in of UK partners in the synergy grants. I think there it's really important that we let our European colleagues know that they should engage with UK partners again. But conversely, the UK partners should talk to their European colleagues and say, look, we're here again. But otherwise, I'm just hoping that the applications will be coming in. And I don't think any ground has been lost because this good science did get done through UKRI funding. The badge of approval through the high level competition did continue. And now we're back. So just apply.
Yeah. Mary, do you want to comment? Because you made that very interesting point that you had thought that Imperial's applications all through that process were performing the same way. But what about the synergy?
I guess the ones that went in were, but I think we did see, not for the ERC, I think we saw pretty much a similar trend because they're very, they're individual. They have the individual can kind of write their grant. They've got their ambition, and that was the more kind of collaborative, larger network grants. We saw a couple of things happen. One, there was, I guess, some uncertainty about having a UK partner, right, and how that would be viewed, right? So, is that going to be refereed differently? I don't think we saw any evidence of that, but that was a bit of a stifling effect on those collaborations. And then even when there was awarding of some of those broader grants, I know not just at Imperial, but in other places, there was a kind of taking the UK partner off the grant at the last minute because of uncertainty about how the guarantee would work, whether that would be an extra layer of bureaucracy. Nobody quite understood what was happening, and it was safer, right? This kind of idea that it was safer, even if they wanted the UK science. What I think is happening is those teams are still talking and collaborating, just the funding isn't flowing. So I think in some sense, I'm still hopeful that we will make up the ground pretty quickly, because I think it hasn't cut off communication. It's just meant that in that space, I think there is a piece around the innovation and SMEs, and George mentioned the bureaucracy. I think it's right for an individual SME to be engaged and kind of drive their own program. It's very hard, but bringing them into collaborative programs in the European programs was actually really beneficial because they could get full costs. So there's no kind of state aid rules that sit in a European program. So there was and so as a university, it actually was easier to bring SMEs into European programs than it is with Innovate. So there is that bit. I think you're right, for individual companies trying to navigate the process, it was hard, but there was a big advantage that we have lost. I think so. Some of those university SME collaborations have suffered.
Thank you, George. Your observations on all that?
Well, I think my answer is 1.6 billion. I think actually the sector, you heard it, did an amazing job at keeping the flames alive and keeping engagement and keeping hope and all of that. And maybe there's a generation that missed it, but I don't think that's the big damage. I think 1.6 billion is quite a lot of money. Maybe the Treasury will announce in the spring that it's all going to be reinvested in a great surge of research.
That would be nice, but not to be spent in 6 months.
Quite,
George.
Do you think all the money that has all the underspent from the years of non-participation in Horizon been allocated to science spend of other forms, or is that some sorry, let me put it more accurately. Is the money that wasn't spent on either Horizon Europe or your other international programs at the time all going to go back into subsequent Horizon Europe, or do you think there's a sort of Treasury clawback still in force?
It should. And if we're to honour the Prime Minister's pledge in CSR 21 of the biggest uplift in science research funding for a generation, which I'm sure he'll want to do. The answer is I'm not quite sure. There's 1.6 in the spring, but then we've announced. I mean, we've announced quite a lot of extra funding, and then the guarantee this year. I didn't have the numbers right to my fingertips, but there's a funding so there's some money this year. I don't know what the final number is, but it must be close to 2 billion. And then a lot will depend on what's announced in the budget in the spring. Right. Thank you. Christopher?
All I want to say is that we often forget how complicated this cash flow is.
Yeah.
Because the flows of money into Europe and the flows of money out are not linear. And it's also the case that the way that the modelling for Pioneer was done is not the same as the modelling you would do for association. So there's a very easy mistake to be made in maths, which assumes somehow or another that you can actually say, there's a number that we didn't get. I don't actually think that's going to be where it lands up. And I agree with Maria very strongly that I think when we look over a long enough time span, taking into account a whole bunch of other things, that it's very easy for us to forget, which is that COVID happened across the part of that period as well. I think we'll find that the dips are really quite small. I also agree with Mary that the challenge is probably around SMEs. Because I think that has been difficult and we need to work really hard on that. But I agree with Maria, actually, that I don't think we should over dramatize this. And I also think we need to be extremely careful about cash flow issues, because otherwise we'll take some logical missteps.
Right. Okay. Another question here. Yes.
The chairman of Red Semiconductors, and you guess I'm involved with semiconductor technology, and I've been lucky. Our company has kept one foot in Holland over the last few years. So we've been benefiting from EU grants through the NGI, the New Generation Internet Fund, through NGI and through NLNet. The refreshing thing I find about the European grant structure is the first question they ask you is, and what is your commercial purpose? Are we going to learn from that? Because a lot of the UK funding does not ask that question. It's research for research purpose. Whereas in Europe, I get a strong feeling the question is, we'll give you money, but explain to us what you're going to do with it in the long term for a commercial outcome. And that's something we should learn from the Europeans.
Right. Okay, very interesting. I'm going to ask George to comment on that. But also, George, do you want to pick up on something? So I'm then going to put to Professor Leptin, the 108%, and you upped the ante by 120%. Just explain to us what happens if we were to go above 108%, so that this new figure of 120%, we understand what it means. We've now entered the currency. Thanks, your powerful.
Yeah. Well, look, on that first, 108 is the figure. The point I was trying to make is it's quite easy in government. You set a maximum number and then everyone undershoots it. I'd like to make sure that it is at 108%. The best way to get to 108 is to aim for something a bit higher. And then you've got a problem, which is you've got all these brilliant projects. What do we do with them? So I'm trying to be ambitious that we don't undershoot. And if we have some projects that exceed the 108 next year, and the EU perfectly reasonably say that we can't fund them, then maybe we go back to the 1.6 and say, well, you see where I'm heading. I just think we need to get back. We either believe that science research, technology and innovation are completely key to recovery, getting out of debt, or we don't. And if we do, and we've said we do, then we should do it. So that was that point. On the point about, well-made point about, I think there are two actually. One is this process has reminded companies that if you've got a foot in different countries, you've got a bit of an insurance policy in post-Brexit Britain, which I think that's to Palab's question, also part of what I think I did my best to mitigate it, but I think there was a bit of damage in that, the Brexit deal was what it was. I was very clear, many of us were very clear, we've just left the political union. We're actively not changing our membership of the research community. I think for a lot of companies, there was quite a lot of worry for a while, and we have to repair that.
Yeah.
And to your point, your other point about the industrialization, it's exactly what I was trying to suggest in the Pioneer piece, that actually Pioneer would have been much more in that vein, and not because it's an important point. I think, David, you're inviting me rightly to kind of address, which is I say that not because I dismiss blue sky research at all. All my career has been, if we've ever formed companies and found value, it's normally come out of people who've been able to do really good blue sky research. It's not that. It's that if we are going to get more money into our research ecosystem, then it seems to me that the challenge is to take scarce, precious government money and match it. And the quickest way to get, if we're the ONS say we're at 2.9% of GDP, to get to 3.5%, we're not going to get there in quickly with public money. But we could get there with a lot more private money. And so I think we do need to be in our own domestic system, much better, without undermining the blue sky excellence, but across our ecosystem at addressing that. And I think you specifically make a point, which I think is about innovate. I do worry that because of a lack of clarity of doctrine politically, our system sort of thinks, well, we can't pick winners. We're basically only addressing market failure. So we pick companies that won't succeed and help them. I think we're in a bit of a muddle, and I'd be much clearer. We're trying to build great businesses.
That's very good. Yeah. And of course, Professor Leptin, I'm sure, will be pleased to hear praise of the experience of doing this within the EU. I just want to press Professor Leptin, however. I think the 108% is one of the most interesting features of this deal. And I just want to understand how, from your perspective, Professor Leptin, I mean, we take George's very good point. The aim is to get British researchers motivated to be properly bidding again, which is one of the reasons why we're holding this discussion this evening. But exactly what does happen if we have the wonderful problem of going above 108, and how the EU and British debate might play out if we find we've been so successful, we're above that. What's your reflections on that, Professor Leptin?
There, I was muted. I have to say that's above my pay grade. So we would love to see all those grants come in. These applications come in. We would, of course, love to see them be very successful. What happens then? It literally is above my pay grade. That is for the Commission to negotiate, and I simply won't comment on that. I would welcome more grants. Excellence is, shouldn't have any boundaries, shouldn't have any constraints. So let's see them come in.
Could I just
Mary,
add in on the kind of innovate piece? I think I would agree with George about the kind of clarity of the purpose for innovate. And I think there's a tendency for it to sit in a silo of, well, all the other research councils are TRL 1 to 3, and innovate sits the 3-4 space. And I've been in collaborated innovate programs where, the company has identified a problem they don't understand. And that requires you to go back to understand it. And then the monitoring officer saying, you can't have money for that because that's fundamental research. So that whole construct of where innovation happens, at which TRL it sits, and how you pull that through, I think, and UKRI ought to be able to do that, right, as an overarching structure. So I think it needs some work.
I think we've got I see several hands up. Are these questions particularly for Professor Leptin while we have her?
Thank you very much. Peter Marsh, made here now. It is primarily directed at George, really, the point that you made, but it'd be good to ask other people what they think. George, you made the point that in Britain, in your pillar 2, that industry, there's one or two really big companies and loads of little tiny ones. To what degree do those little ones get involved with these sort of research programs we're talking about? And is that, if not very many of them do, because they're big enough, compared to Germany, France, etc., is that a failing for the whole of the United Kingdom?
Right, part of that, I'm going to take, as I saw several hands up, I'm just going to collect several interventions now. In the far corner there, yes? Here comes the mic.
I'll use this. My name's Simon Lloyd. I'm the founder of a project called Space Elevator. I've worked on a number of projects with my other businesses where we've looked at grants from Horizon. We've worked with Imperial. We spent a lot of time applying for grants. I'm actually more encouraged with what George just said. We are now looking at other forms of funding to do with crypto funding, cryptocurrencies, and tethering. If you know anything about this, I can tell you more about it later. But I think you should be looking not just at grants, but at other forms of funding that are now coming available for some of these more ambitious projects we're looking on the space programs. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think, yes, there was a question here. Let's collect that as well.
David Ingram from the University of Edinburgh. I wanted to ask people what they felt about the development of new researchers and about the sort of support for early career researchers and where that's going. Because to go back to a point that
Yes.
Mary made earlier on, I think we have seen a generation who've been affected by COVID and affected by Brexit, and it's important that we get them into the position where they can be applying to Maria for
Yes.
for European fellowships and things like that.
Yes. And then there's another question right at the back there. Yep, in the far corner.
Thank you, Andrew Mackenzie from the Physiological Society. How much of the fantastic work with reassociation to Horizon Europe is at risk with some of the immigration changes, particularly the visa charges, but also the salary increase that was touched on by a couple of participants? How much of that is, I guess, pulling in the opposite direction to some of the really good stuff that's come out around Horizon?
Thank you. I'm going to go around the panel. I'm going to start, and this might be an opportunity for some wider reflection. But Professor Leptin first, and particularly those two questions towards the end, the early career researchers. One of the metrics I used to follow quite closely was the age distribution of PIs winning grants. And you do want to see people in their 30s and of course in their 40s winning grants. And we always thought it was one of Britain's strengths. Do you track the age distribution of PIs winning in ERC grants? And how do we ensure that this gap that Mary here referred to of people who maybe haven't got into the habit of applying to ERC, how can we overcome that? And also, you did refer to the migration issue, and we completely understand your concern. So your comments on that as well, please.
Yeah. So, but the first one, the ERC grants are for independent researchers. So they're for people who have shown the ability to independently carry out frontier research. And that is very different in different fields. So, among the mathematicians, we have people apply in their late 20s, even mid-20s, and be completely stumped by the question of the panel chair, whether their thoughts and ideas are their own and independent, or whether they're driven by their PIs. They don't even understand the question. Whereas in the life sciences or in engineering, where people are really kept for long postdocs, that is more difficult. I think this is a problem I would like to deal with, but we're sort of past that. It's a career problem where young people are kept in dependent positions for far too long. UK used to be very good at that with short PhDs. Even in my time, postdocs were not 5-6 years, although I did 5 years, but at least I started young. So that is the problem. We can't say we give grants to young people when young people are being kept as pairs of hands in large teams as cheap labor. So that really has to be dealt with at a completely different level. You know, I always say Darwin was 27 when he went on his Beagle journey. And not only that, you can say, well, crazy scientists, you know, not exactly a position of responsibility as they would have to have now. The captain was also 27, captain of a ship. I mean, for heaven's sake. And we can't give people independence until they're, God knows, middle of 30s. So unfortunately, not my problem, or unfortunately not one that I can solve. What was the other one? Briefly, because then I really have to leave. Oh, you're muted. I can't hear you.
Yes.
Oh, the pay. Yes. Well, you know, I'm not formally an EU official, which would ban me from meddling in other countries' business. But sure, the attractiveness of the UK for researchers has, I mean, we know what Brexit has done for that. And this immigration policy, it does not sit well with people who want exchange, who depend on exchange, who are willing to explore, who are willing to uproot from their current place. You know, these are not people who are seeking, who are coming to the UK to take away other people's jobs. These are people who enrich. It goes in all directions. The same is true for European states. So I really think you will find a way of reassessing that.
I think, Professor, we must let you go now. We're very grateful to you, Professor Leptin, for joining us. We're grateful not just for that, but also, if I may say so, the way in which working with UKRI and Christopher Smith in particular, the way in which that guarantee program was operated, your willingness to consider UK applications, and of course UKRI's willingness then to guarantee them, has, I think, meant that we are indeed able to resume our participation with far less damage than would otherwise be the case. And we very much appreciate what you did then, and I think will have a lasting effect. And thank you as well for joining us this evening.
Well, thank you for those kind words. I have to say, to me, that's natural. And all it has done is shown that we belong together. And so I think that's the overriding sentiment this evening and over the last few weeks. And I really look forward to our interaction picking up again.
Thank you very much. Yes, well, it was wonderful to have her with us. It's actually their European friends who are so sorry about our departure who make the whole Brexit thing most painful, I have to say. But that's a different story. That's a different story. We are moving on. Now, I think what I will do is I will give our three panelists, Christopher and Mary, and then we'll end with George, an opportunity to pick up on those questions. We'll then have a quick drink. We will assemble downstairs for dinner at 8. So this will carry on. So you can be relatively brief now, and we will resume over dinner. But Chris, your observations on what we've heard and those particular questions that were raised?
So I'll try to pick up a little on the innovation side and more perhaps on the early career researchers. And you can remind me if there's anything else you'd like me to say. I think my observation would be that in a career spent much of it in Europe, most of the countries I met found something at fault with the way in which their equivalent innovation schemes worked. And I think it is easy for us to be overcritical of ourselves. I don't think that UKRI has in any way resolved all the issues, some of which have just been raised about barriers across funding schemes. And I'm sure that there is a lot of red tape and bureaucracy around what we do in UKRI. I think we're working on that. There are Innovate UK people in this room, and I would say that Innovate UK were incredibly flexible, agile, and energetic in making sure that their side of the guarantee was held up just as much as the other side. And it's worth saying that the checks that they have to do for guarantee are really significantly greater for extremely good commercial reasons than the ones we have to do for the academic one. So I actually would like to pay a bit of tribute to the Innovate UK staff who made the guarantee work so well for businesses. There's more to be done, of course there is, but I think quite a lot of this actually reverts slightly to George's point about clarity of overall direction. And in some senses, there is a North Pole that we all need to be drawn towards. And there are a whole bunch of issues here. Mary mentioned, for instance, creative industries. Now, I think at the moment it's a very interesting conversation to be had about the way that creative industries drive technological innovation. If we concentrate on foundational technologies, we may actually miss some of the intersections and interactions. So there's something to be done there. And that's the point made by the Council of Science and Technology in their letter to the Prime Minister. On early career researchers, we've just announced the Future Leader Fellowship round, which we pledged to at risk when we were worried about issues of overlap between different schemes. There has been a huge amount of work by the National Academies on early career researchers. Early career researchers have succeeded in gaining grants through the guarantee. I don't for a moment underestimate the fact this has been an extremely challenging period for everybody who's been working every stage through. I think that the issue of how we pack something around supporting various areas of the various segments of our sectors in applying is a very interesting one. And I think that to some extent, and I'm absolutely not ducking the point here, but to some extent, universities and clusters of universities are in a far better place to do this than anybody else is. And I don't think we should underestimate, we're very good at this. We're very good at saying, what will somebody else do? Rather than saying, look at all the things we are doing. No university that I know of doesn't care about its early career researchers. No university that I know of isn't trying to improve people and culture. No university I know of isn't looking at how they can support their staff. There is a resource issue, of course, but there's not a will issue. And I think we should recognise that and be very grateful to our universities for all that they have done over this very difficult period for everybody, students, postgraduates, and early career researchers. I think I'm going to say one thing about 120%, can I?
Yeah.
However it works, there is one way in which it mustn't work. It mustn't work that we end up having to pay a sum of money which is gouged out of all the basic research which is happening in the domestic budget and leave some of the underpinnings of the other work that we're doing endangered. This will be something it's worth bearing in mind that we won't be able to really see this for some time. I think the negotiation is going to be quite complicated on that. But I do think at some stage we'll need to grapple with the fact that there's no contingency pot.
Yeah.
Because there isn't a contingency pot, it will be very easy in a strapped situation to turn around and say, well, let's just take it from. And that taking from ultimately will be exactly the way of undermining confidence in the system, support for early career researchers, support for collaborations, support from SMEs and business. So at some stage we'll have to grapple with that. The way of grappling with it is not to say, let's gouge it out of the rest of the system.
Yes, that is it's always high risk to play a game of chicken with the Treasury. So, so like we'll go above 108 and you'll be sitting, it'll be so tough, you're going to have to bail it out. Yeah, there is can be done, but it's a high risk strategy. Mary, your comments.
Yeah, well, I would just like to agree with Chris on that final point. It's really critical that we protect the research base because it's that which allows us to be excellent in Europe and not to divert funding from that. And also, I agree with you on the Innovate response around the guarantee. I think they had quite a complex challenge. They're very entrenched and conservative, I think, for good reasons around the regulations, and they did pivot. So I would agree with you on that. I wanted to come to your questions about grants and for SMEs and what the most effective space. And I think you're actually talking about several different things. There's There's collaborative programs where you can address some of those research questions that require you to work in this more collaborative space. And actually, I think then the grant program, it may be bureaucratic, but it works. There is a broader problem around investment and capital investment in deep tech in the UK, and the government is looking at that in reforms to pensions, thinking about how you better have government-enabled accelerators, and I think that is moving in the right direction. And I think there is an awareness that we need to think better about how we provide investment and capital and grants in the disruptive deep tech space, which is I know also a passion of yours, George. For ECRs, I absolutely agree. It's the university's job to look after their own staff, but I think that needs to be done in, I guess, a broad, coordinated framework of making sure that there are the right support structures, the resources, the funding that allow us actually to bring those individuals on and support them. I just want to touch on Maria's point, which I think is more structural, actually, in the higher education system now around longer term postdocs. And I think every university is wrestling with this problem. I think there's a little bit of conservatism got into the system where we could almost expect before somebody's given a lectureship that they've held 3 independent fellowships. And it's almost that, and I probably am speaking as an independent now in this particular perspective, and not on behalf of Imperial College, but I think there is a tendency to now hire for demonstrated impact rather than hiring for potential. Right. And that's quite hard to do. And I think we do need to find a way to recover some of that kind of growth of our own people earlier on. Actually, it's hard because we're in a resource constrained system, right? So it does become hard, but I think that's important. Whilst at the same time thinking about what are those career pathways for people that aren't going to get the lectureships but are really critical to our infrastructure for supporting all our research base. What are the right research? What are the right pathways? I think we all as a sector need to do better on that, and we are recognizing it, but I think we can do that. Yeah, that's a very powerful warning. Very good point. George, you're briefly, then we're going to have a drink and we'll resume over dinner. But anything you want to do, just briefly pulling the threads together?
Yeah, just to deal with the 2 questions that were asked and then some threads. Peter, I think it was your question about Pillar 2. Why is it Rolls-Royce and then lots of companies I've never heard of? I think the answer is partly the structure of our economy. Germany, France, Switzerland, they have a different structure. 72% of Swiss graduates go into industry. Yeah. But I think the other reason is that this is the opportunity that I think we should grip. Around UK commercial innovation, Horizon is thought of as an academic program. And I think there's an opportunity in this reset to say, this leads to a slightly bigger question. I'll come to in a minute, but yeah, it is an academic program, but it's an academic industrial innovation program, and you should all be participating in it. So I think that's a part of the reason why, and that speaks to the relationship between science, research, and industry and innovation difference in this country and in, say, Germany. To the point that Simon, I think, made about the Innovate UK grants. So I would completely echo Chris's point about Innovate. I think Innovate is one of the jewels in the crown, and I think Indra Mukherjee is doing a brilliant job. It's really hard, but I think the political steer has been really unclear about what the doctrine is. I'm very clear, but there've been other signals as well. Sajid said we don't do industrial strategy. I'm in a building that says it, but we don't do it. Kwasi said, well, we sort of do bits of it, but we don't really intervene. We certainly don't pick winners. So I think there's been a really confused signal. And I mean, Boris was sort of hugely, well, we pull every lever. Come on, let's use all these freedoms. And I'm more in that camp. I think it's a luxury we don't have. We have to pull every lever that we've got. And I think, so I think there's been a lack of clarity. And this is a huge simplification, but I think we're sort of playing 1 or 2 club golf and Innovate, whose job really is to grow an innovation economy in all of those facets. I think they're very focused. They've been told to be very focused on TRL 4 to 6 to 7. Pick companies, not ones that would have succeeded anyway, mind, only ones that are market failure. We're putting a lot of work into sort of avoiding failure, nurturing great companies, and then when we think they're at TRL, we chuck them out the nest.
Yeah.
We don't use procurement, we don't use regulation, we
Yeah.
don't properly support them.
Absolutely.
And that's not a criticism of
Yeah.
Innovate, who I think are brilliant.
Yep.
It's a doctrinal problem, which sort of, I think, raises an interesting question we could kick around over dinner. Go back to those numbers. I talk about 20 billion a year. That's 60 billion over a 3-year. We're currently at 52 billion. I think there's a danger, and it cuts both ways, that everyone thinks that's all UKRI. And across government, everyone says, well, that's a lot of money we'll have. Hang on a minute. The UKRI budget is the 8.3. So it seems to me, if we're really going to grow this innovation economy, there's a blue sky core research budget, which is kind of the UKRI budget. There's a innovation economy piece. And at the moment, remember, of course, lots of other departments, MOD, DFT, have got big R&D programs, which are not properly coordinated. Innovate do a lot of that work. So one of my crusades in DSIT was, please, can we map, as the Science, Innovation and Technology Department, what we total expenditure, I know what the UKRI is, and get a more rational approach. And it took the finest minds in Whitehall, with a few other things going on, I accept, 12 months to just work out what we're currently spending, a word I'm banishing, by the way, I was banishing to replace by invest. Yes. We still don't know what the private figure is. Yes. So we are, within government, within Whitehall, we're a long way away. And my worry is that people will start to think, well, UKRI, I've got all this money, we'll take that. And I think there's also danger for UKRI in making the case of how important you are, that you give the impression you're doing everything. And to me, we need to get to a point where the core research budget, which funds excellence, young, mid-career, late career excellence, drives an innovation economy, which we attract all sorts of other money to. Global, sovereign, family, wealth, philanthropic, industrial, and we're going to unlock the city. That's a whole other thing. And I think at the moment, everyone thinks this is all UKRI, and it isn't. Okay. And getting that conversation right over the next few years is going to be key.
Yeah,
I do agree with that.
Very interesting. Thank you very much to our panelists, and of course to Professor Leptin, who's left us. I think what you've heard in those final remarks is some of the wider reflections of our departing science minister. So what I think we should do now, it's an opportunity to carry on this discussion, both of course about remaining EU association issues, but also more widely over dinner. And as it is now 8 minutes to 8, and we've been talking about innovation, there should be a very bold innovation, which is, I think, rather than taking a detour and having drinks and then going to dinner, as time has passed, we should head straight down to dinner, and we will regain some time. We will start dinner at 8 o'clock downstairs as usual. We'll start dinner at 8 o'clock downstairs as usual. And after a while, I may turn to George for even more indiscretions from your time as minister, please. Thank you all very much indeed.